Now we're going to go on to our local resiliency planning lesson session with James Murley and Dr. Francisco Pena. James, aka Jim Murley, is the Chief Resiliency Officer for Miami-Dade County. Mr. Murley previously served as Secretary of the Department of Community Affairs under Governor Lawton Chiles and was appointed Chair of the Florida Energy and Climate Commission by Governor Charlie Crist. Additionally, he served as Executive Director of Thousand Friends of Florida, spent over 10 years with Florida Atlantic University overseeing research on urban and environmental issues, and served as Executive Director of the South Florida Regional Planning Council. Mr. Murley is also the founding member of the American Society for Adaptation Professionals and Resiliency Florida, and a board member of the Southeast Coastal Ocean Observing Regional Association. Dr. Francisca Pena is the Resiliency Project Manager at the South Florida Water Management District with expertise in compound flooding interactions. Dr. Pena holds 2 PhD degrees in Earth Systems Science from Florida International University and Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Florence. Currently, Dr. Pena serves as the Compound Events Expert for the FIU UNESCO Chair on Sustainable Water Security and is the co-chair of the International Policy Committee for the Association of Floodplain State Managers. I am going to turn it over to you, Jim, to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning. I've just arrived from another country. That's Miami-Dade County to the east. What a delightful drive. You know, when you come across 75, you realize how much we share, how the Everglades are so important to both of our coastal communities, and how different we are. You know, there's real choices that have been made on the West Coast and the East Coast, a legacy that we all live with today as we take all this fantastic data and try to move forward. You know, I'm here to talk about how do you take that data in a resilience envelope and take action. That's my job at Miami-Dade County. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer. I work for the mayor of Miami-Dade County. Now, I know those of you in local government here, you have mayors. Often they're appointed by the commission. In our county, we're a constitutional home rule county. The mayor is elected by everybody in the county. So he or she is like a county manager or a city manager. In Miami-Dade, it's kind of unique. The mayor is also the sheriff, the election supervisor, and the tax collector. So it is when you operate in that form of government, you have a strong executive, and all the employees, we work for her. We're the 7th largest county. We share the public policy responsibilities with 34 cities, who all do a great job, but we still have over 1 million people who live in unincorporated Miami-Dade County. So they look directly to the mayor and to her staff for the kinds of services they otherwise would get from the city. And we have the 3rd largest school district. So, and the last little factoid is that 52% of the people who reside full-time in Miami-Dade County were born in another country. So it's a real international melting pot, and we're challenged by a lot of legacy decisions that were made. Everybody wishes you could do do-overs, but they're not. You know, we have to look at where we are, this data, this projections, and move forward the best we can. So let me talk about resilience as a planning concept. Before that, we used it in this framing. You can find it in Webster's, right? You can be resilient, resilience. I'm not sure about resiliency, by the way. Resiliency may or may not be a real word, but with the Y. But it's quickly being used almost in the same way as resilience and resilience. So, in our job, we look at the whole scope of what the county is responsible for with our partners, with the Water Management District, with the Corps of Engineers. You'll hear me talk about them. But here's the way we think about the future. What are the shocks and stresses that we could expect to experience, not just from climate. A climate shock would be the arrival of a hurricane and the terrible experience that you all had a couple of years ago. I mean, over the last decade, from Charlie down to Ian, this region has really experienced that shock. Or the stress. And we've all heard a lot about sea level rise. Sea level rise is a stress. It's not an episodic event. So it makes all the events worse. The military talks about it as a force multiplier. And that's essentially what it is. We're not going to drown because of sea level rise. But we could drown because the sea level rise makes the next storm surge wave on top of the hurricane even more dramatic. So think about shocks and stresses. Shocks can also be totally non-climate. In the time I've been Chief Resilience Officer, almost 10 years, some of those shocks include the tragic loss of a building coming down in Surfside. That shocked the entire community, led to a whole bunch of changes, including laws that are pending in Tallahassee as we speak. It could also be other things. So I just want to put that framing for you, because that's the way we organized our office. Oh, I got to get this thing moving, which is this first slide. Got it. So we've been at this since the 1990s. So when you have that kind of a commitment in the county government our size, where we started thinking about energy first. How do we manage our energy? We are Florida Power and Light's single largest energy client. Usually come in a little bit over $100 million a year. So you can spend a lot of time thinking about energy efficiency and conservation. And how within the realm of how we do things in energy in this state, which is not the same way they do it in other states, but the way we do it here, what are the options we have to reduce carbon to play a role in changing the emissions that come from the generation of electricity and transportation? Those are the two killers for emissions in our state. We don't have a big industrial base like Houston, which has a whole other set of challenges. So we got into it that way. That's what we call mitigation and energy climate. But we did evolve. So that this office today has about 27 employees. It works on energy efficiency and climate mitigation, where we're looking at the very things that, that create the climate changes we're looking at. And we're also managing our energy use. Adaptation, which is how do we, I think the state CRO, Dr. Brooks, stated it very well this morning. There is no scenario where we're not going to be having these effects modified by climate change in the future. You cannot wall them off with a 12-foot wall that the Corps can design for you. It's about living with water. And that's the way everybody that ever came to South Florida had to face. That living with water was a common denominator. We have built an urban environment on top of that landscape, which changes the dynamic and makes us responsible for how do we do that as we go forward. But adaptation is key. That's what the state's focused on. I'll tell you, as I've spent many decades doing urban planning, there has never been as much money available from the federal and state government on adaptation and mitigation as there is today. So if you're in a local government or even a not-for-profit, there are funding sources out there today that didn't exist 3 years ago, all to address the things that you're talking about yesterday and today. So we have a unit just to talk about communications. That is probably, when we had the opportunity to kind of reorganize, I wanted to prioritize communications, because this stuff can get pretty dense. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of graphics. How do you translate that into real actions that people can take? How do you measure actions to see if you're effectively addressing the problem? And then how do you communicate it? We're responsible to our mayor and our 13-member county commission, but constantly dealing with the media, and a media that is far more diverse than it ever was decades ago. So we focus a lot on communication. We've added Biscayne Bay. Biscayne Bay, you know, we are jealous of what you guys have done over here, managing a watershed around an estuary. A lot of good work here we are looking at now as we were late in the game to think about Biscayne Bay. The watershed for Biscayne Bay is 95% within our county, but we didn't have an overall plan or organization to address that. And we were getting climate impacts. We were having we had fish kills because of heat. We had that shock, and we had stresses that we could see on the bay's marine life, on our seagrasses. So all those shocks and stresses ingredients, the mayor said, let's stand up a Biscayne Bay program in the resilience office with all of our partners in the county departments, our cities. And we're moving, but we're watching to see the successes that have happened over here, Sarasota, NEP, Tampa Bay, NEP. This one, I think the way it grew and to be a watershed plan is what I made sure we did in Biscayne Bay. It's a watershed plan, like what you have developed here. Extreme heat is, we had a hot summer. I don't think you guys had something similar to that. And all of the data shows that happening progressively. And to do that, to look at that and to take action means who are the most vulnerable people that are going to experience that? Because a lot of us have the luxury of living in an air-conditioned or working in an air-conditioned building or air-conditioned home, but we depend on a whole lot of working folks who are outside in construction or in our agricultural area. Or in other service areas. So we have gone about trying to see what we can do to put practices in place which allow for getting ready for those extreme heats. When you get the heat plus the humidity and the feel-like temperatures, you're going to get on alerts. It's really like getting ready for hurricane season. We had a heat season declared in Miami-Dade last year. So it's something that we all know about. It's like, what's new about the heat if you come to Florida? But it's going to get more intense at certain times, and we have to look out for the most vulnerable. So we've stood up a program within our office. Future Ready is where we're really trying to understand the dynamics of where we're headed in the future. A lot of it, I go back to the funding opportunities. A lot of what we're doing right now is about focusing on new grants, bringing those external funds in. It costs a lot to do the things you hear about the last 2 days. You can't all do it with local funding. You can't all do it with state funding. So how do you leverage dollars? And that's where our Future Ready is. And then the last edition was zero waste. Remember I talked about shocks. Well, every community produces waste. Unbelievable amount of waste. Our society is based on an economy that creates packaging. You all know it. I know it. Every day what we do, and we all can take actions, and I bet every one of you does that to some degree. But in the end, some city or the county is picking up your waste, or a private contractor allowed to do that, and then it's got to go to a landfill. If we didn't do composting or other kinds of things that they do all over the world, but we have dependent on landfills, and in some of the really big counties like ours, a waste-to-energy facility, where you have a burn facility. You create energy, but you basically, with intense heat, reduce that bulk down to a small amount, comparable. Our waste-to-energy facility burned down. So that was the shock about a year ago. The waste did not stop. So the mayor said, all right, we got to take this one on. And that's not just we, the Office of Resilience, it's the entire county. But the zero waste piece was, how do we reduce the waste flow? We have another county department that's tackling the tough issue of collecting the waste. But if they have less to collect, we have less cost of disposal. Disposal, folks, is coming down to putting it in trains. and taking it out of our communities to other places. It's a commodity, and people are making money doing that. That's okay. There's waste management in the Republic, that's okay. But we have to think through these issues, because solid waste is going to be a harder issue to deal with as the groundwater comes up and we get these intense storms. So why did I spend the time on the Office of Resilience? I wanted to make sure you understood that in our county, resilience is this broad range of shocks and stresses. It's not just the climate and weather and flooding, because we found the need to look at these together. We do action reports, just like you've heard about, I'm sure, in the last 2 days. They're all online. We have a lot of plans in any of our communities. They're very important. These are what we call strategies, action strategies. They list things that cost money. Hence, that's the business we have, is to link the money to the action steps in these plans so that we can move forward. This is a real picture. It's not an AI picture. It is an event that we had at a king tide, sunny day flooding, and it's not, sea level rise had an impact on this, but there's no substitute for when people have to experience things like this. And then if they have the time to think about how it could change even more in the future. I think it's important historically to understand that, you know, we're such a low elevation. Our end of the peninsula at times has been overwhelmed by water. And right now, you know, we have a stable shoreline being impacted by all the things we've been talking about. But it's all about managing water relative to the land. That's how we created this wonderful paradise that we live in. It's how we will have to maintain it and enhance it. Nature can do a wonderful job helping us, but we must put our hands on the levers and manage the water relevant to the land to accomplish the things that we're talking about. I think Carolina had some of these before and after pictures. I think there's a lot of fun. This is the Miami River Canal. Here's another shot. So you see Brooklyn downtown. That's today. 1 acre of land under one of those buildings about 5 years ago sold for $125 million. That's just the land. So that investment you have to go vertical, and of course that is Southeast Florida. That's Miami. That may not be right for where you guys are, but you know, vertical development actually you can manage a lot of things that way if that's where your community is headed. We don't have land left to go out horizontally very much more, but this is where we are. This is what we inherited, and we're going to grow with it, and we're going to manage the water, and we're going to deal with those shocks. This is our slide on sea level rise. You know, I don't really, not being the scientist or the data person, I'm not exactly sure where on those graphs we are. What I have figured out is that none of in the history of our state, the last 150 years, everything we're expecting is not a straight line projection of where we've been. It's all based on the scientific models that the district has, that the state has, that are done internationally. They are projecting accelerations of the rates we had in the past. If we just had a straight line projection, we'd have rising sea level rise. We had about, 10 inches in the last 100 years. It takes you up to that lower dashed color red line. But those new elevations, the 2 feet that we're expecting, that's because of the emissions in the atmosphere warming the ocean, causing it to expand, causing the sea level rise, causing the salt water to get under our freshwater ground table and moving it up. The net effect is these folks might not be walking in that deep of water, but they're walking in water. And that's why we have to be focused on these issues. That's what we are planning for. And you have to accept what is special. I'm not a geologist, but I know in our part of the state, the southeast corner, the porous lime rock represents a specific kind of challenge, right? It allows that saltwater intrusion. It's pretty stable. We don't get a lot of, our part of the state, unlike Tampa, we don't get the sinkholes. But it requires, it also means you can't build walls that are going to seal you off. It's going to go under that wall one way or another, and the hydrologists can do all the planning. But that's important. You guys have probably a little bit different geology, but know that in the kind of work you're going to be doing. Again, the elevations are key. These dark browns, literally, when the Spanish came, when Flagler built the railroad, and that's maybe the most important thing that happened in Southeast Florida, they came right down that dark line. That's the highland. The engineers said, if we're going to build a railroad, we're going to build it where the land is the highest. And to a great degree, we have developed on those areas. But we developed way over them also, and to the west. And in those cut-throughs, those light areas, which I think they're calling transverse glades, is that right? Something, I think the natural folks call them that. That's what they were. That's where the canal system is that is maintained by the Water Management District in the secondary canals. So that low ground is where we have to interface a lot with the canal system, work with the water managers, work with the communities that found themselves in those low areas. I live on one of those dark brown areas, and it doesn't flood today. I know we're gonna have floods in the future, but it makes a difference what your elevation is or what the elevation of your floor. Compound flooding is something that we're continually aware of. You can't just isolate one event like tidal flooding or shoreline erosion. These things happen in combination. And this is particularly important to Carolina and I when we work with our third partner, the Corps of Engineers. They tend to come at you with a project to take care of one of those arrows. And we have to struggle to get a broader picture because we can't just build structures to keep out the storm surge. If we've had a significant rainfall on the land area, we're trying to pump that water back to the sea. So the Corps gets it, but they've traditionally applied themselves through these authorities, and working that out is a key thing, I think, for any community. But these different types of flooding made worse by sea level rise are what you need to think about as you do the kind of work that we're all doing with those state-funded studies that CRO Brooks talked about. One of the things we realized, not just in the last year, some of these rain bombs, people call them, these shocking 20 inches in 24 hours, completely took out Fort Lauderdale Airport. Yeah, they're affected by climate change, but they're weather events, and they're getting more severe more often. So we had to back up and say, yeah, we got a lot of those plans, all those documents I showed you. We didn't have a flood response plan in place to deal with that kind of an episodic event. So now we're gearing up for it, and we just did a scenario plan around it, because these are the things that disrupt folks getting to their businesses or getting to school on that one day, and there are financial losses. They're not as significant as a national emergency, but they definitely fall in the category of things that our mayor gets a phone call about. The sea level rise strategy has 4 or 5 main approaches. The reason I like to talk about this is it's not all about just structures to keep out the water. It's also about the way you decide to plan the future of your community, where you're going to put the future growth, how you're going to redevelop. Again, we have a higher density community, so we are focused on developing around the stations where we're building our rapid transit system. We get multiple benefits from that. Those are areas by design are higher and elevated out of the floods. Folks don't need to have their cars as often. They're getting choices in transportation, so our emissions are less. And we're providing riders on a publicly supported transit system. And we're thinking through a whole bunch of other things that are logically what we're going to have to change as we go forward in the future. In that sea level rise strategy are 10 action items. I'm not going to go over them all. I will talk a little bit about the first one, adaptation action areas. So if you remember, there's those cuts through the transverse glade areas where the engineers later built the canals, and where we had the initial 1930s, 1940s, 50s, 60s development. Right on the drainage system worked. Took the groundwater over to the canals and flushed it out, and people could live and build on those areas. They flood today on just a minor storm. So we went in and said we have a big county, we need to focus and prioritize, so we have areas we call adaptation action areas, where we're in there at a street level with the folks that live there. There could be schools, public facilities, trying to do a neighborhood level plan and getting the neighborhood to tell us what they experience, not so much what's in the data packages, but what they're experiencing, and tie that together with data, tie that together with these new funding, and actually do some things to give some relief to those areas that have to adapt faster and have less resources than the other parts of the community. So adaptation action areas, which is in state law, so if you're in a city or a county and you want your community, they're not required, they're optional, but we found them to help prioritize the areas that need help in the short term. And you can see those C4s, C3s, C9s, those are canals operated by they're the Central and South Florida Flood Control Project, owned by the U.S. Corps of Engineers, operated by the South Florida Water Management District, and to those canals are a whole host of other county canals and city canals. And it's like an interstate system, you know, with roads feeding into it. They all have to work. If those sea canals aren't working, every stormwater plan in Miami-Dade County doesn't work. So we have to work on that, as Carolina said, together to make these things make sense. Oh. Yeah, so there's an add-on here. I'm going to skip along because I can talk too long. Here we go. Regional work is important. We've been doing the regional work on climate for 15 years. Every year we have a big climate summit. This year we had 900 people there and this is not a regulatory body. It is voluntary of the 4 counties, and the 100 cities in the region can collaborate with us. They don't have to pay for it. But it has been just instrumental in helping the 4 counties deal with all the issues and having an interface of those 4 counties with the other levels of government. So I think this is going on here. I'm not an expert on this corner of the state, but reinforce the regional work. It helps the locals do what they need to do, and it gives the state an easier place to do some of the work, just like this watershed plan. The Corps is it's one of the oldest institutions in the U.S. government. And it's part of the Army, part of the Department of Defense. They have been instrumental in Florida's history. Jacksonville is our district, our home district. They are really important to our side of the state because they construct the projects. And we have found that we had to look at that total amount of projects in an integrated way, not just the flood projects, but also the navigation projects and the beach projects. If you're going to do constant beach nourishment, which we all have to do, sooner or later you're going to be in an agreement with the Corps. And you're going to have to understand how they do their work. They're good people. They have a lot of regulations. But the important thing for us as local government officials is to coordinate that across your landscape. Don't just let one project drive everything else. We have been through a 3 or 4 year experience after Hurricane Ian, we understood we were very vulnerable. The city of Miami has not had a storm surge wave since 1926. We had a tremendous wave when Andrew, which is in the south part of our county, but the city, the urban area, like the wave that hit Fort Myers Beach, we haven't had it. Nobody alive that experienced it. So we needed to gear up after what we saw happen here. We got into with the Corps. They wanted to build a lot of walls, structures. It didn't fly in our community. We understood it may have given us the highest level of protection, but it didn't give us the highest level of enjoying the place that we live. So we're now into working through what we call the multiple lines of defense, which starts to build on every part of the landscape, producing a way of reducing the energy of that oncoming storm wave so that we reduce the loss that comes from that. Certainly lives, but the Corps is there also to help us reduce damages. And these are the kinds of the things that we look at in that regard. And that's what you have to think about if you work with the Corps. a lot of detail and a lot of work with your congressional delegation, the Water Resources Development Act that goes into Congress. Thank you. I hope that that together with all the other speakers and the information, you'll be able to pick what makes sense for you. That's the most important thing. What makes sense in this region? Get an action plan and go find the money. Thank you.
All right, good morning. I truly appreciate the invitation to be part of this talented panel. I thank the organization for the opportunity. I'm very happy to be here. And today since I come from a flood modeling perspective, today I'm gonna share with you some preliminary results of a high-resolution, bidimensional hydraulic tool that is able to capture the details of flood inundation across Collier County. Before I start, I would like to thank my colleagues from the South Florida Water Management District, in particular to Carol Ballard, as well as Noemi Gonzalez from Flood2D, for the model and scenarios development under a project that was mostly funded by UF and the South Florida Water Management District. Okay, so Collier County, similar to Miami-Dade County and South Florida, is highly vulnerable to different types of flooding events, flooding conditions, from flash flooding, pluvial, fluvial, coastal, and even groundwater-induced flooding due to its low elevation, porous limestone environment. As several speakers have mentioned, we live in a very complex system. And over the past few years, we have seen that extreme hydrometeorological phenomena, such as hurricanes as well as rain bombs, have demonstrated how difficult it is for the different cities and municipalities to be prepared for compound flooding events. This is when two or more flood drivers interact simultaneously. Also, as Jim mentioned, we have different stressors, such as the king tides and the sea level rise, that can also exacerbate flooding conditions across the system. And this trend is putting enormous challenges not only at the urban infrastructure, but also the storm drain system due to the reduction in the storm drain capacity. Now, if we look at the other side of the spectrum, for example, non-catastrophic events, let's think about sunny day flooding. It might happen as a result of king tides, but nevertheless, it also produces high socioeconomic direct and indirect impacts. For this presentation, I'll be introducing the Flood2D Collier County model, I won't go into details since this is not a highly scientific event, but what I want to say about the model is that it's capable of simulating in a bidimensional way the physical processes of rainfall runoff as well as flood routing through the floodplain as well on the channel. And the water moves into 8 different directions, and it's based on the governing equations of continuity and also the dynamic wave momentum equation. It's important to consider that this model is capable of simulating not only hydrologic, but also the hydraulic model. Therefore, there's no need to separate both processes, as both are simulated within the same modeling framework. So the Flood2D model for Collier County consists on 4 subdomains. This decision was made in order to balance performance, but also high level of accuracy and detail. In this case, we have from 25 to 50 grid resolution, which is certainly an advantage if we want to understand the complex flood dynamics within the neighborhood and road systems. It's important to consider that 3, subdomain 1, 2, 3, are highly urbanized, while subdomain 4, which is located at the southern portion in green of the subdomain, is predominantly a natural area. Now, the model has different components in order to replicate in the best possible way the physical processes, and these include rainfall, variable infiltration, the roughness coefficient, boundary conditions inland as well as in the coast, levees, detention basins, hydraulic structures, and many more. But what truly sets this model apart compared to others is its ability to simulate inland urban flooding conditions, specifically incorporating all the urban and drainage components, in other words, the storm drain system. And 3 out of the 4 subdomains have a detailed storm drain network, as you can see in the presentation. Now, let's talk about the calibration results. The model was calibrated using Hurricane Irma, and we were able to obtain available historical data to make this comparison. On my right, you will see, the comparison using the predicted flood inundation depths from Flood2D at different locations in the subdomain compared to the high water marks from the USGS that were downloaded from the flood event viewer. And we can see that there's an important consistency between the predicted with the historical records. In a similar fashion, in the center, we can observe the results of the hydraulic, the time series analysis on some of the canals compared to the time series from the district tidal structure. This information was obtained from DB Hydro, and we can see that the behavior is highly consistent. We were able to obtain high calibration results for all subdomains. And this was also the case for validation results using Hurricane Ian. As we can see, a pretty good match between the measured versus the predicted maximum stages, as well as the comparison between the USGS high water marks and the Flood2D predicted maximum depths. It's important to consider that in this collaboration, there were some deliverables that were produced separately between the district and Flood2D, and this is one of those in which the coastal boundary condition came from SERA, which is the University of Louisiana coastal emergency risk assessment tool. Here we can see an example of the level of detail provided by the storm drain system on the neighborhood localized scale. It's important to consider that for this specific presentation, the water bodies were not masked, so you can see those through, but also the inundation is located not only on the streets, but also on the green areas as well as in the backyards. Here's another picture just to understand the value of high resolution models in terms of understanding which areas might be flooded or not. Okay, now let's talk about different comparisons. So we received the results, and we were interested on understanding what is the value of adding the storm drain system as part of the flood model. The blue areas represent a reduction on the maximum flood depth. So this is because the storm drain collects the water from the neighborhood, and then it discharges this water to the water bodies, ponds, and lakes, as you can see in red. Without the storm drain system, the water surface elevation will increase, and eventually we'll have to move through natural drainage paths or result in overbank flow. So in a nutshell, the storm drain system effectively removes water from neighborhood localized areas and also reduces the time of these flood inundation depths to reach its maximum peak. Now we're going to talk about future boundary conditions that were used for some simulations. For the inland, we have the flow rates at canals and other structures provided by the district model, the BCB flood. For coastal, this information and data comes from the CH3D model by UF. And for the ground, which I will talk in a little bit later, the mangrove condition, this comes from the CH3D warmer model. Now, during these presentations, we're talking about the compound. And as a flood modeler, it is important to try to distinguish the relevance of different flood drivers. How do the flood drivers interact within each other? Is the flooding mainly responsible for rainfall, for surge, for groundwater flooding? So as part of this exercise, the team decided to simulate different conditions by turning off different flood drivers. The first one, which says rainfall off, we can observe how the surge propagates inland and also through the water bodies or the canal system. At the center, we observe when the surge is off, the impact of rainfall across the domain. There's certainly some overlapping between the rainfall off and the surge off. And we can tell that some areas within the green in the center can be considered part of the transition zone when both flood drivers interact and produce worse flooding conditions if they were not so that's an important component to consider when simulating flood drivers in the same model. This is important because the interaction will certainly increase flood inundation depths. And last but not least, on the last map, we observe what will happen if we turn off the infiltration parameter when we are running flood models. And all those pink areas resulted in higher flood depths. This model does not consider the groundwater component. it only considers infiltration. So this is an area of opportunity to enhance the model in the near future. Okay, let's talk about mangroves. First of all, I'm certainly not an expert in this topic, but it's certainly an interesting area of research, specifically from the flood modeling perspective. And I would like to quote Patrick, as he mentioned earlier, that this part of the state, southern Florida, has the largest amount of mangrove forest across the Gulf of Mexico region, which is important to consider. And also, mangroves are fragile components that can change and are vulnerable depending on different factors, including the temperature, but also sea level rise, as well as storm intensities. Okay, so how did the team represented mangrove expansion or mangrove migration inland? In the flood 2D model, there's a parameter called Manning roughness coefficient. This parameter represents the resistance of flow moving inland, and it was decided to, from a conceptual approach, this is still experimental, to change the Manning roughness coefficient based on the results that were provided by CH3D warmer. I believe this was presented yesterday. By the way, I wanted to mention that there were 6 categories identified on changing the mangrove, or in this case, the land use coefficient, which include the open water, the mangrove, salt and fresh marsh, cypress, as well as upland forest. Something that I also wanted to mention is that Flood 2D is a hydraulic urban flood model that has certain limitations, and one of those is that Flood 2D, similar to other flood models, is not able to include or to capture the wind and the wave forcing factors at the coastal boundary conditions. So in this case, the information provided by other models is used as input for the coastal boundary conditions using water levels, and then these water levels propagate based on the elevation towards inland. The following results compare 2 scenarios and show the differences in flood depths between the future conditions with the original Manning in terms of the vegetation and those based on the inland mangrove migration. As I mentioned, the team increased the mangrove area in zones that previously did not have the mangroves. These maps were used as a reference. But do now, and in zones that already have mangroves, and we increase the manning to demonstrate the density of those. Nevertheless, this is a hydraulic model, and of course, the Manning roughness coefficient ignores the mangrove physical characteristics, such as the tree density, the tree height, or the stem size. This is just an effort to quantify the effects of mangrove vegetation in a 2D inland model. These type of comparisons or results have been produced in the past, also by our colleagues from Florida International University, in which they produce a coefficient map to account for the effects of changes in land use on storm surges. Again, the plots and results presented in this presentation are preliminary, not official, and conceptual. The simulation does not intend to provide any conclusions at the moment about the role of mangroves in the attenuation of storm waves. This is just a scientific exercise to understand a little bit better what can be done and to share with the public the potential impact and interest in order to pursue an additional study in this regard. Some of the conceptual adaptation alternative recommendations that were produced by the Flood 2D report include the beach and dune sand nourishment to reduce the floodway propagation, enhancing near-shore vegetation density, building elevation for new shoreline development, and elevating and protecting emergency access routes and emergency facilities. This information, again, are conceptual and have not been modeled or tested as part of the Coastal Collier Flood 2D LOS project. In a nutshell, we understand that Collier County is predominantly vulnerable to coastal-induced flooding. The storm drain system and infiltration parameters are critical to be incorporated as part of flood simulations. And it's important to use the adequate tools to account for compound flooding. One tool might need to be coupled with additional tools and results in order to account for the interaction of inland as well as coastal flood results. Now, potential next steps. First of all, increasing the manning roughness might be an effort that could be extended as an internal research with the Flood 2D model. Also, advancing the existing Flood 2D model by incorporating the groundwater component, in this case, mud flow, to understand and account for the surface-subsurface water interactions, which are clear in South Florida. And last but not least, create a building exposure database across Collier County to test cost-effective adaptation strategies that could be useful to reduce flooding conditions in the future. And these account structural measures such as pumps, raising canal bank elevations, canal dredging, coastal storm surge protection, but also nature-based solutions. And it could be simulated together as a bundle or individually. So this could be also an important step to assess the most effective solution or mitigation alternative for the future. Again, I appreciate the support of the Flood 2D as well as the district team, and I'll be happy to answer to any questions. Thank you.
Right, we have some questions already coming in, so if we can highlight the first one. Mr. Murley, you mentioned that we're in a better position in Southwest Florida to plan ahead than you all were. Any outstanding lessons learned for planning that we could apply now while there is still time? Would you like me to repeat that, or did you get it?
No, I got it.
Okay.
Yeah, like I said, you know, we no do-overs. You get the legacy that, and you have to deal with where you are and use the science, the technology. Think regionally. Keep doing this regional work to support the counties and cities. Look for multiple lines of investments or actions. There's no single bullet out there. We've made some poor decisions in the past in our county, thinking that we are solving a problem, only to find out later that we didn't have redundancy. We didn't really understand the operations management costs. You've got professionals that work in your communities or are available through firms, but think multiple lines. Well, we've developed. instead of just one wall is this idea of multiple lines of defense. I think the same concept can be applied in other resilience questions. Education. You have wonderful higher education schools here, state and private, in the K-12 system. This is an issue that the next generation is going to be experiencing what we do. So we have to get them engaged. They know how to use social media better than most of us, and that's, you know, a constant reminder to me. Thanks.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Pena. What opportunities do infiltration areas present?
Well, infiltration is definitely an important component to incorporate in any flood model, as it can, you know, absorb important amounts of water for, I would say, high frequency storms, 5-year, 10, 25-year. But it's also important when there are unusually high water tables in the system, as it can produce an exchange between, you know, bringing the groundwater induced flooding towards those infiltration areas that are considered. So it's definitely important to account for infiltration in any type of flood model in South Florida, as well as the groundwater table. I will highly encourage that. Otherwise, we will be missing some of those micro-scale neighborhood interactions between surface and the groundwater table.
Great. Mr. Murley, this question's for you. How are you all building resilience planning into emergency management practices as well?
Well, you saw that I was stressing organizational components. And so in our now Department of Emergency Management, it was a lower level, we have a Deputy Director for Resilience who was just hired. So our theory is that while we have the Office of Resilience, we have experts in each one of the departments that have the same concept of dealing with resilience. So that's one of the ways that we work with them. That storm response plan was a specific responsibility of our Department of Emergency Management, working with FEMA. And the other thing that we've done, here's a really good thing that any local government can do to bring these issues home. We all probably, I'm just going to make the assumption that the federal flood insurance program is in all the communities. There's a program called the, oh my goodness, community rating system that every city and county can provide to FEMA a document which they audit that says, we've done these things that are going to reduce the loss from all these multiple flooding events. And because of that, we think the premium costs to our residents should be lowered. It's on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, 1 being unobtainable the best. We've been at 5, and with a coordinated work across all the departments led by emergency management, we just went from 5 to 3. And everybody in unincorporated Dade County, the cities had their own ratings. So you can do that with your floodplain managers and your emergency management people in your counties and cities. And it's an education process. And the thing is, it delivers a benefit to the policyholders, which is really, I think, a helpful loop.
And our next question is for Dr. Pena. What does development on vacant land immediately landward of mangroves decrease their effectiveness with regards to storm surge protection?
From a professional perspective, I cannot answer to that question, since I have not run those type of models and account for the mangrove component. Is a relatively new area of research from my side. But let's think about a floodplain. So what happens when a floodplain is urbanized and there's buildings and roads, absolutely. The amount of rainfall that will be held within the urban space will increase flood inundation depths and eventually add additional runoff to canals and rivers. So it will urbanized area will definitely have an impact on surface runoff.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. There were so many excellent questions, but I hope that each of you will take advantage over the lunch break to talk with our presenters if your question has not gotten answered. Thank you to our panelists.